Ladies and gentlemen, my name's Paul, hopefully having an amazing day. The PlayStation 6 is already deep in development over at Sony according to a report online. And once again, AMD are going to be in charge of producing the chip for Sony, albeit of course a very custom design. And one of the primary reasons that AMD once again have managed to snag the contract is because Sony want backwards compatibility to be a big focus of the PS6. For example, being able to run PS5 games natively. Now, this report is over at Reuters, and of course I will leave a link to it in the video description, but I also want to give you guys a little more information as well, since I've already put out a few videos regarding the PS6, including what I've been hearing about in terms of the release timelines of the console, and also just what the goals are, because, well, yeah, I have put some information out already, so let's first of all go over the article. So according to the report over at Reuters, Intel were actually also in the race for producing the chip, but basically in 2022 AMD managed to snag the contract entirely, and now they again are working with Sony. Now I will say that in previous videos I had mentioned I hadn't heard anything about Intel, but I had heard that Nvidia were also asked, and I once again asked a couple of sources about this just before recording this video, and I was told yes, Nvidia were also at one point, approached by Sony, or they approached Sony. It's not clear exactly which way it happened, but also on top of that, Qualcomm and ARM. And if you think about it, it's not very difficult to imagine that multiple companies would have approached Sony, or Sony would have approached multiple companies, because like, if you're buying a TV, it's not like you just go for a TV, right? It's like you're gonna ask around. And it's the same thing, like, if you're even having, like DIY done, like, you're having, like, an extension to your house. You don't just go with the first dude who gives you a quote. You're gonna ask several people. And of course, this is much the same how the companies are gonna operate. And when you're dealing with consoles, there's a lot to it. One of them, of course, one of the big things is just what tech they have available, but also the timelines and the deliverables. So when we are looking at things from a desktop perspective, for example, we're going to say, oh look, Zen 4, oh look, RX 6000 series, or RDNA 2, or whatever. However, it oftentimes isn't quite so simple, and you can have times where, for example, Sony may have a custom piece of technology required, or AMD have a piece of technology that's going to be on the roadmap, but it's going to be available before another specific thing is. So this is of course where sometimes we've seen this with the PS5 Pro, for example, where RDNA 4 is going to be the IP for ray tracing, but the rest of the GPU is essentially going to be RDNA 3.5-ish based. So there's a lot to it. It's also timelines, there are things like prices they need to worry about, the just simply how many units they can produce. There's just a lot to it, and it's quite complicated, so it's a really big deal, of course, for Sony as well for backwards compatibility. As an aside, while PS5 was specifically mentioned in the Reuters article, just from a technical perspective, I imagine PS4 would be pretty easy as well. Because Sony basically have patents for how the PS4 backwards compatibility runs on the PS5 freely available. Basically speaking, there are a couple of ways it does it. It reduces the clock frequency of the CPU, it adjusts the amount of cache that the application can see, and so on and so on. There's a lot to it. So I don't think it's going to be very difficult for Sony to do that. And this is theoretical, this is not a rumour, this is not something I've been told, just want to be clear, but theoretically, even running a PS3 game on the PS6 could be achievable, because, like, there are PS3 emulators available for the PC, and you would imagine Sony's own engineers would be able to do a better job. And I don't mean that in a disrespectful way for the people who are creating, like, the emulators on the PC, who are doing, like, PS1, PS2, or PS3 emulators, because bloody hell, they're good. But it's more like, well, they literally have all of the SDKs available. The engineers, in some cases, literally worked on the hardware, and they also are designing the emulator for a completely bespoke, enclosed design. In other words, They have full control over the operating system, over the API, over every little minute detail. They don't need to create an emulator that's going to work on NVIDIA GPUs, AMD GPUs. And if we're talking about AMD GPUs, which AMD GPU? Are you talking about RDNA 1? If we're talking about RDNA 2, are we talking about RDNA 3? If it's RDNA 3, which variant of RDNA 3? It becomes so difficult. Like, these are just so many things you have to worry about on the PC. It's like, even if you're producing an emulator that's going to work on a PC, and let's say you say, well, okay, this emulator is going to be targeting only Zen 4, which Zen 4? It becomes really difficult. We talk about, like, you know, only an 8-core Zen 8-core Zen 4. That was very difficult to say. Okay, is that with X3D or not? You kind of get my point. Like, it becomes kind of zany at some points, and these are just, I am slightly exaggerating for comical effect, but my point is that if it's a console, Sony have, like, so much more fine-grained control over the ecosystem that the emulators can run in. They could do some really crazy crap. Like, again, I am extrapolating, but, like, you've seen RTX Remix for PC. Theoretically, they could do some really nut things. They could do some nutty things, even on the PS4 or PS5, and they could, well, maybe PS4 games, maybe not PS5, but they could, like, do things like inject ray tracing, upsample the games. Like, it could do some nuts things if they really wanted to. But again, that's outside the topic of the video, and I want to be very clear. I'm spitballing. That is not from my sources. That's just, you know, just saying what they could do theoretically. Because again, we've seen this on the PC. We've seen, like, Switch emulators that you can inject ray tracing in with Zelda, that type of stuff. So there's some really crazy things that Sony could do, depending on how they tackled the emulation for older PlayStation hardware. Anyway, getting back to what I have heard about the PS6 though. So yes, it's going to be using some variant of Zen. Hiccups, sorry. I've heard it's possibly going to be Zen 7, but at this point, IPs are very difficult to nail down. The release window, I've heard, is 2028 to 2029, but that could slip. It's really going to depend a lot over the next several months, because at this point, at least the last I heard anyway, while AMD are locked in terms of who's providing the contract, again, this is based on some older information, so things may have changed. I'll try to get more info. But the last I heard, basically, AMD had won the contract, but at this point, there weren't locked-in specs. So it's not like they had, as an example, you know, 32 gigabytes of GDDR7 with, you know, 12 Zen 7 cores or something like that. No, it was more like, these are the requirements, gathering phases. And again, I really want to be clear, this could have changed. However, it seems that Zen 7 would match the window of release, and, you know, we could probably say an equivalent IP of RDNA, but because it's custom designs, it's, you know, what custom work is Sony going to do? You know, they customize their stuff a lot. The Zen 2 cores for the PS5, they cut the AVX instructions. They also did some other stuff, if memory serves. I can't specifically remember what, but I think they removed some functionality that was specific for old variants of PCs. I can't remember exactly, and they tweaked some of the caches. I think so. They reduced the latencies between the caches. With the PS4, they bumped up the number of asynchronous compute engines and compute queues versus what was available commonly at the desktop. I think it was like 8 and 8. So it was 64 total, I think. And I think it was like the GPUs like the R9 290 or something like that that were the first to do it on the desktop, and Sony basically came to the market first. So again, when it comes to desktop IPs versus what Sony does, it's not necessarily 100% a one-to-one correlation, because they mix and match and also add their own custom crap in. But anyway, what I will add to all of this, in terms of the requirements, or should I say what Sony have been speaking to developers with, obviously improvements in CPU and GPU performance are a given. They're not just going to go in and have the same level of, you know, CPU performance from one generation to another, But what they will do as well is really focus on machine learning. Now, we've already seen some examples of this with PSSR, and the reality is, like, upscaling is now just going to be a standard thing. Even NVIDIA, you know, multiple times at this stage, NVIDIA are just saying that AI, DLSS, you know, all of these technologies are just going to be how games are created in mind. It's like, eventually, for NVIDIA anyway, they're even talking about, like, everything will be AI generated. Like, textures, everything. Now, I don't think we're going to be there yet with the PS6, however, things I am hearing about is that they want to really improve physics and simulations. So, for example, how cloth and water and fire and all of this stuff behaves. Now, yes, obviously we already have, like, water and other, you know, real-world simulation of physics, so clothing, that type of thing, but it's still not exactly a one-to-one in how the real world works, so there's definitely a lot of room there. Another big thing is, well, just improvements in how characters behave, and by characters I mean like NPCs. And Sony, obviously, one of the big kind of selling points for PlayStation titles, as many of you know, are like, well, narrative games, right? So just having characters that kind of behave more realistically, so whether that's enemies or whether that's your partner, there's just a lot of work that I think Sony can kind of do in that area. There's examples of this already, actually, with NVIDIA Avatar Cloud Engine, or ACE. We already saw the ramen shop demo, where basically you can speak to a character, and essentially with Avatar Cloud Engine, you can basically give prompts to a character to behave in a specific way. It's essentially ChatGPT, albeit on steroids. So you could say, in the case of like a character, okay, this is what we're going to do. We're going to set them up to be very helpful, but we're going to make them sarcastic. We're going to say that they were, I don't know, like maybe a shop owner, and we're going to make it so that they're going to be a bit of a scoundrel, and you can kind of like set these parameters, or maybe you'll have like another enemy that's going to be really aggressive. So for example, you're creating an NPC that's going to just be really aggressive, kind of charged towards you, but they're also going to be smart, so it's not like they're just going to be a berserker and it's just like yippee-ki-yay and just run at you. They are going to be kind of clever about it, but they are going to also just be ultra aggressive and kind of push towards your position. But maybe you could also have another group of enemies that are going to be much better at just trying to flank you, stay at range, using like a bow, and just be very good at communicating with one another. There's just a lot of stuff they can do with these type of interactions in terms of AI. But also AI is going to just be a really big deal in general with upscaling. Obviously, once again, we've seen PSSR. The development documents are stating that we're going to already be pushing to like 8K. I don't think Sony are ever going to go to like 16K outputs for the PlayStation 6, because, you know, the niche numbers of people who have like any display available like that is just going to be absolutely minuscule. However, there are just tons of things they can do in terms of ray tracing. We've seen a lot of elements, a lot of movement already on ray tracing for DLSS, ray tracing reconstruction. You can imagine how we can start to improve that significantly with the PS6. I also suspect that the PlayStation 6 is going to be chiplet based. I've had one source tell me that Sony are designing a chiplet based chip that's going to have a large maul. So it's going to have basically a large last level cache. I don't know if that's true. I've only been able to get that from one person, and because again they haven't decided on the specs, I do have some level of skepticism about that. But given just the challenges of creating large dies at this point, like again, node shrinks are also a thing. AMD are basically pushing more for most of its graphics IPs. You know, the rumor is that that's one of the big focuses as well on like future APUs. I don't mean Strix Point, I mean like ones in, you know, coming into the future. So I think it's very logical that Sony are going to embrace this as well. And there's a lot of really cool things they could do, you know, in terms of the caches, because again, caches are just really important. It's also going to be very interesting to see how this compares against the Xbox. Sarah Bond, she's basically said that the Xbox is going to be one of the, or I can't remember if it is one of or the largest. Someone can correct in comments below, but she basically said it's going to be one of the biggest leaps in, you know, tech ever. And that's a really bold statement because, like, look at the NES versus the SNES. Look at the SNES versus the Saturn, or what? N64 or the PS1, or the PS1 versus the PS2. It's ridiculous, honestly. Like, if you haven't seen a PlayStation 1 versus a PS2 game in a while, please go and check it out. Like, look at the difference. Even like on the what would you call it? Like the release games on the PS2, like Tekken Tag. Compare that to Tekken 3 on the PS1, or look at Metal Gear Solid 2 and 3 running on the PS2 versus like Metal Gear Solid 1. It's just like, dude, it's ridiculous. Or even another crazy example is Code Veronica versus like Resident Evil 1 on the PS1. It's nuts, just the difference. Like, it's honestly crazy. So I think it's a really tall order. So I think very logically AI is going to be that driving force for the Xbox, and again, the PS6 seems to be doing the same. But that said, guys, I think I've waffled on enough. Jesus, I can't speak today. I'm having one of those days. Take care of yourselves. Bye for now.